Okay, well, I want to thank Jan for the kind introduction, and both Jan and Olivier for this wonderful invitation. I accepted it without second thoughts because it's on a topic that is dear to me, and of course I always wanted to come back to Prague. It's an amazing city. Now I've chosen to talk about a rather morbid topic, death. I mean, it's a topic fit for middle-aged professors who reflect on the end of life. And the title, Fading Away, the first part of the title, came to me while I was reading Paul Feyerabend's autobiography, Killing Time. The final chapter, it's a very moving chapter where Paul Feyerabend tries to come to terms with his impending death, has that very title, which suggests that death is a slow process and a painful process rather than an event. And I think this is a very nice metaphor for describing the end of the lives of scientific objects. It's never an event, it's always a process. And as we will see, a very painful process. So here's what I will be talking about. I will give a synopsis, a summary of my previous work, biographical approach to scientific objects, and I will explain in what sense scientific objects have lives. So it's important to understand in what sense they have lives if we are to understand in what sense those lives end and can be lost. And I will suggest that the end of the life of objects can happen in various ways that depend on the kinds of objects that we are talking about. So to unpack that multiplicity, I will offer a tentative and incomplete, of course, taxonomy of scientific objects. Then I will proceed, I will come to the main part of my talk, where I will discuss various ways in which objects fade away or pass away. And I will then end the talk with a very brief sketch of the career and the death of the ether, which was the object, and I emphasize this, the object of 19th century physics. So let me start with the biographical approach. I think it has been developed in different ways, overlapping ways, but different ways, in three books. The first is Hans Jörg's Toward the History of Epistemic Things, whose focus is experimental objects and what he calls epistemic things. Then we have Rainy Daston's collection, Biographies of Scientific Objects, which covers a wide variety of objects. And then my Representing Electrons. So I decided not to talk about Hans Jörg's books since he is here, so I didn't want to take the risk of describing in an incomplete and unsatisfactory way his own take. I'm sure he will talk about his own approach himself. So I will sketch my own approach in Representing Electrons. There I suggested that scientific objects have lives in three different ways, three different aspects. First, they have heuristic power, that is, they guide research, they raise new questions. Okay, we'll see that in the case of the ether. Then they are recalcitrant objects. They resist manipulation. And how they do that? They do that by becoming incoherent. So when scientists endow them with new properties, those properties sometimes, if not often, do not cohere with their previous properties. Okay. So the scientists have to do something about that. So in that sense, the objects are participants in scientific practice. Okay. So in both of these senses, positive and negative, scientific objects are alive. And the third dimension is identity. Okay? And I tried to make sense of that in the book. Scientific objects persist as unified objects of inquiry. That's very important. I took the phrase unified objects of inquiry from Alistair McIntyre, and I think it's a phrase that captures the unified character of scientific objects. So I found the metaphor, the biographical metaphor, useful precisely because it captures these three aspects of the lives of scientific objects. Okay, heuristic power, resistance to manipulation, and identity. And this is a theme, of course, that resonates with Hans Jörg's work, especially the recalcitrance part and the heuristic power part. I mean, these are themes that he has also stressed. Now, let me elaborate a bit on the biographical idiom. In representing electrons, I focused on a theoretical object, and I adopted expressions such as birth, character formation, and identity. There I suggested that the birth of an object amounts to the emergence of an explanatory representation in response to various problem situations, both conceptual and empirical. An outcome of that birth is that various phenomena are grouped together as manifestations of the same object. And this is how the object is individuated. That is, as the hidden counterpart of a group of phenomena. Now, after the birth of the object, its character, namely the properties that are attributed to it and its modes of behavior in various situations, is gradually formed. Okay. And this character is subject to change. However, there is a core of properties that are resistant to change and, quote-unquote, define the object in question and enable its identification in diverse experimental settings. Now, as long as a theoretical object remains a fruitful investigative tool and the phenomena associated with it remain intact, the object remains alive. Now, death comes when the object ceases to aid theoretical practice and runs out of explanatory power. As a result, the bonds that tie together the phenomena associated with it start to dissolve, even when the existence of the phenomena themselves is not questioned. Now, typically, the death of an object is accompanied by the birth of another object, which takes over part of the explanatory role of its predecessor. Now, in representing electrons, I did not elaborate on the dead aspect and the death aspect, and this, of course, is related to what Jan previously said about the neglect of the degradation or the death of objects. There, my focus was on an object that remains alive and well. Okay, it appeared in the late 19th century, but it's still part of the physicists and the chemists' research practices, so I didn't have to really think hard about how objects pass away. And I relish the occasion to do that here. Now, if there is life, then there is loss of life, and the way we conceptualize loss of life is directly related to the way we conceptualize life. So what would the death of an object look like? The first aspect would be loss of identity. So an object may mutate into a different object altogether. And a symptom of that kind of death is the dissolution of the ties among the object's observable or experimental manifestations. Another aspect of death is personality split. An object may acquire multiple personalities, being endowed with different characteristics depending on the circumstances in which it is used. And this happened in the case of phlogiston at the end of the 19th century, at least from the point of view of its opponents, who claimed that it had turned into a protean entity, okay, taking different faces in different situations. And a third dimension of death is loss of fertility, loss of heuristic power, loss of capacity to generate surprises. Thus, an object may become sterile, of no further use to research. I think Hans-Georg would say here that objects who lose their capacity to generate surprises do not pass away, but turn into technical objects that are still used in research, but not as objects of investigation, but rather as epistemic tools. This is also a possibility. Now, as I said, when objects die, they are replaced by other objects, and the metaphor of death is quite appropriate because this is a very painful process, and we'll see that in the case of the ether. It was the abandonment of the ether, the rejection of the ether, was a very painful process for its adherents, and many of them never made the switch. Okay, they kept believing in the ether till the very end of their own lives. Now, the precise manner an object loses its life depends on the kind of object it is. And here I will draw upon a tentative taxonomy of objects I suggested in an article that came out of a conference at the Max Planck on historical epistemology and was published in Erkenntnis in 2011. There, in that article, I suggested that if we want to understand the historicity of scientific objects, we have to take into account the plurality of scientific objects, the fact that scientific objects come in different kinds, and I offered a very brief and I'm sure incomplete taxonomy, but on the basis of that taxonomy, I argued that the question of the historicity of scientific objects admits different answers depending on the kind of objects that we are talking about. And here I want to make a similar argument with respect to the death of scientific objects. So what we mean by death depends on the kind of objects that we are talking about. So let me talk about a few types of scientific objects. The first type is naturally occurring entities, for example, planets or heavenly bodies, and I want to juxtapose that with artificially produced entities, for example, genetically modified organisms. So here the crucial distinction is between the natural and the artificial. The first are objects that we observe without having the ability, the capacity to intervene in their lives. The second type is objects that we bring about and we can intervene in their own lives. Now, a related distinction is between naturally occurring regularities. Again, an example comes from astronomy, the retrograde motion of the planets, a phenomenon that was observed in ancient times, and the juxtaposition here is with artificially created phenomena such as the laser. Another variety is observable objects that are accessible to unaided observation without instruments versus indirectly observable or even in principle unobservable objects. Now, some of those objects are purely theoretical. Okay. The objects of theoretical discourse without experimental counterparts, for example, black holes, versus objects of experimental investigation, experimental objects that have not yet been developed in an articulated theoretical framework, and such an object was electricity in the 18th century. It was an object of experimentation, even though there was no satisfactory theoretical framework in which electricity was embedded. So this tentative and incomplete, I mean, it's a part of the taxonomy I suggested in that paper, throws into relief, I think, the complexity of the ontology of science and lends some initial plausibility to my plea for a pluralist account of the death of scientific objects. And these distinctions, of course, are not sharp. Okay? So as with most distinctions, there are many borderline cases where it is hard or altogether impossible to decide on which side of the divide they belong. So if we take the distinction between the natural and the artificial, or between the observable and the unobservable, we see that there is a gray zone where it's very difficult to say whether something is natural or artificial or observable or unobservable. But I fully admit that, but the value of this classification, as I see it, it does not depend on the existence of sharp boundaries. Rather, it lies in indicating that the questions regarding the death of scientific objects admit different answers, depending on the particular kind of object we are dealing with, even though there are cases where we can't really tell whether an object falls in one side of the divide or the other. In any case, there are certain questions that have to be addressed, and here we may talk about historical thanatology, to use a Greek word. So we have to understand how objects pass away, what exactly comes out of being in those cases, what accounts for death, for loss of life, and what replaces a scientific object after its death. So in response to those questions, I will suggest three theses, three answers. The first is that the ontology of science is so rich that we can give general answers to these questions. Okay? So the answers will depend on the type of object that we are talking about. And I will give examples in what follows. To come to terms with this variety, we need to develop a pluralist metaphysics that will make possible to understand this diversity and the various modes of existence. This is a phrase that Bruno Latour uses, of scientific objects, the various modes of becoming of scientific objects, and the various modes of passing away of scientific objects. In all of those cases, and here there is unity, there is uniformity, the death of objects is a process. Okay? And that's why I use the metaphor of fading away rather than an event. Okay. Now I will focus on three cases. The first is natural objects, naturally occurring objects accessible to observation. These objects emerge when individual things are tied together by means of new concepts. So when they are brought together under a particular system of classification, and they pass away when those ties are dissolved. Okay? So death is, in this case, is dissolution of ties among things or phenomena. Okay, so the degradation of objects in this case is a result of the crumbling of a particular system of classification and the realization that it does not reflect a pre-existing order in the world. Now the second type is laboratory phenomena. I won't talk much about them, but I wanted to bring them up because they are important. I'm sure Hans-Georg will talk much more about them. Now, when do they become scientific objects? When they are literally produced in the laboratory. And do these objects ever pass away? Okay. Now, in the history of physics, I couldn't come up with an answer to this. I mean, I couldn't think of an experimental phenomenon that was produced in the laboratory and pass away. But perhaps in the life sciences, it's different. Okay. So what would passing away mean? In this case, it would mean that the conditions that are necessary for the existence, for the production of an object, are not obtainable anymore. Okay, but as I said, I couldn't think of an example from the history of the physical sciences. And then the third type is hidden objects, okay, that are not accessible to observation. How do these objects come into being as scientific objects? When they are literally postulated, and they are postulated for theoretical purposes, for explanatory purposes, okay, and they pass away in different ways when the criteria that are involved in the individuation change, thus destabilizing their identity, and in many other different ways that I will talk about a bit later. Okay. Now let's start with the first case, naturally occurring objects, and then let me give an example from the history of astronomy. The case of planets. When did planets appear? I mean, it's well known that they appear in ancient times, and they were grouped together by ancient astronomers and by Ptolemy in particular on the basis of a single criterion. It was planets were those objects that wandered, okay, in the sky, that performed irregular motions, okay, against the background of fixed stars. Okay, so that's how they were individuated. I mean, there are many heavenly bodies. Only certain of those bodies are planets, those who wander against the background of fixed stars. Now, this property held them together. Okay, so that criterion was really constitutive of those objects. Okay, so without that criterion, there would be no planets. Okay, just an amorphous domain of heavenly bodies. Now, when did those objects pass away? With the rise of the Copernican astronomy, which challenged that criterion, challenged that criterion reflected a pre-existing natural order, and replaced that criterion with another one. Okay, what was the other criterion? The name was retained. Okay, planets, but now a planet meant something different, an object that revolved around the sun. Okay, so the death of that particular object, the Ptolemaic planets, was just a symptom of a conceptual reorganization, a reclassification of the heavenly domain. Okay. Now, I talked briefly about this. I will skip this, and I'll move directly to the main part of my talk. Hidden objects, indirectly observable or in principle unobservable. Now, here things are more complex. And this is indicated by historical fact that both the birth and the death of those objects is often accompanied by very protracted ontological disputes. Okay, we see that in the case of the atom, a huge debate that lasted for a whole century. We see that in the case of the ether, whose demise again was the subject of heated discussions. And the existence of those objects, as I said before, is postulated for explanatory purposes. And so this is the inauguration of their lives. And when that happens, various phenomena coalesce as manifestations of a single object. So our knowledge of those objects is always mediated by our theories. Okay, so usually the death of an object is associated, is just an aspect of the abandonment, the rejection of a theory. Okay. And these objects come with certain conditions of identity. There's a stable core, or there must be a stable core of meaning that is sufficient for identifying that object, and there's a stable or expanding set of phenomena or experimental effects that are attributed to that object. Okay. So these are two conditions of identity. If we don't have that, then we cannot talk about a single object, but we have to think about the possibility of having different objects, one replacing a succeeding one, replacing a preceding one. So, when those conditions of identity are not satisfied anymore, those objects pass away. Okay, I'll skip that. So, here are some ways of in which scientific objects pass away. As I said, when we're talking about manifest objects, passing away is associated with reclassification, with conceptual change. When we are talking about artificial phenomena, passing away is associated with alteration or abandonment of material practices. And when we are talking about hidden objects, death, passing away, is associated either with radical conceptual change, destabilization of the core of meaning, or fragmentation of experimental manifestations, loss of fertility. Okay, the object becomes useless in various ways, it becomes irrelevant, superfluous. It may resist experimental detection. Okay, all these things happened in the case of the ether. The ether gradually became irrelevant or resistant to detection. And when that happens, a competing object is born. Okay. Now some morals from all this. As I said, in all of those cases, the death of an object is a process. If we're talking about a reclassification, this is obvious. Okay, it took the good part of a century for the Ptolemaic astronomy to be replaced by the Copernican astronomy. So the construction of a new system of classification that is associated with the death of an object is a long process. So it's no wonder that death in this case is a process and not an event. Now, during that process, certain practices associated with the older object become obsolete. Okay, as we will see in the example of the ether, a good part of 19th century physics focused on ether dynamics and its relations with matter. Okay, so there were many problems and questions associated with the ether as a scientific object. When that object passed away, all this domain became obsolete. Okay, and that had a lot to do with the resistance of the older generation, that was trained, okay, in ether dynamics. Understanding the ether was, a life project, and suddenly to realize that this object doesn't even exist wasn't something that one could accept easily. And something that we also see in those cases is that there is a rewriting of history. What was a momentous discovery turns into a fiction. A discovery is unmade. We see that both in the case of phlogiston and in the case of the ether. So if you look at 18th century chemistry, some people at the time, and I have in mind Joseph Priestley, talked about phlogiston as the most important discovery of the 18th century. Okay? And in the beginning of the 20th century, we see something similar about the ether. I mean, there's a text that I have it in the written paper, but not in the presentation, that talks about the ether as the most important discovery of the 19th century. Okay? So with the death of an object, the discovery is literally unmade. Okay? What was a discovered object now turns into a fiction. So these are three dimensions of the death of objects that are particularly important, I think. Both that it is a process that certain practices become obsolete as the object passes away, and that history is rewritten in the process. Okay, now let's move to the ether and try to be a bit more concrete. As I said, the ether was the object of 19th century physics. There is a lot of scholarship, for the most part older scholarship. We start with Edmund Whittaker's classic History of the Theories of Ether and Electricity. It was published in 1910. The first volume was published in 1910. And then there was another volume that covered the period from 1900 to 1926. I think it was published in the early 1950s. It's internal history to the highest degree of internalism that you can imagine. But it's really competent, and Whittaker was a mathematical physicist, so he was able to understand the nitty-gritty of all the mathematical aspects of ether physics. Then there is a collection with a text edited by Kenneth Schaffner, 19th century ether theories, that was published in 1972. And then a very, very interesting book, which I read from cover to cover in preparing for this conference. I highly recommend it. A book by Lloyd Swenson with the characteristic title The Ethereal Ether. Okay, ethereal in the sense that it was hard to pin down. Okay. And it covers the 19th century, the whole period, from the early 19th century and the beginning of the wave theory of light till the 1920s and 1930s, when several experiments that attempted to detect the Earth's motion through the ether failed consistently. And then there is a collection, Conceptions of Ether, edited by Jeffrey Cantor and another editor, Hodge. I can't recall his first name, but again it was published in 1981. Okay, so this is excellent literature, but it's older literature, and I think it's a high time for a new history of the ether to be written. Okay, from an updated historiographical and philosophical perspective. It's a daunting task. Because, as I said, the ether spans the whole history of physics and to some extent chemistry too in the 19th century. But it's a charted territory. I mean, these books have produced a map of ether-based physics. Now, the ether goes back a long way. One may argue that it goes back to Aristotle, but in any case, it was an important entity in the 17th century for people like Newton and Descartes and Huygens. Why? I mean, they didn't specify it, but it was important to them for coming to terms with action at a distance. Okay, so Newton speculated about it. It was important for him. Important to him for understanding how gravitational action is transmitted. I'll show you a couple of quotations later. But in the 19th century, the ether emerged as a solution to an empirical problem, namely understanding the wave properties of light. Okay, so from its beginning, in the 19th century, it was associated with a particular theory, the wave theory of light. Now, as it developed in the 19th century, it was endowed with counterintuitive properties. So physicists had to represent it as a solid. We'll see why, and that was a paradox, of course, because the ether pervades space. So how come a solid can pervade space? How can the planets move or the stars move through the ether if it is a solid? It was heuristically important. It generated new questions, especially about its relations with matter, that occupied physicists, especially after the middle of the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, it was fully established, completely established, and I will show you some quotes from eminent physicists at the time that show no doubt whatsoever about the existence of the ether. And then in a few decades, it disappeared. It disappeared not completely, because there were physicists who kept believing in the ether, but for the younger generation, it became obsolete. And this had a lot to do with the impossibility of its detection and the rise of an alternative theory, relativity theory, that rendered the ether superfluous, as Einstein said. So let me go briefly over the prehistory and birth. Do I have time? 5-10 minutes more? Okay. Now look at what Huygens said in 1678. Now it is inconceivable to doubt, okay, that light consists in the motion of some sort of matter which exists between us and the luminous body, but it cannot be any transport of matter. So the ether was important for understanding propagation, okay, either propagation of light or of any force whatsoever. So the ether in the 17th century, as I said, it wasn't specified in detail, but it was suggested to come to terms with a conceptual problem, okay, action at a distance. But in the early 19th century, it was suggested as a way to come to terms with the wave properties of light, okay. And in 1802, Thomas Young suggested that this entity pervades the universe. It's very rare, very elastic, and whenever a body becomes luminous, it excites undulation, it excites waves in this medium. Okay. Now, in the 1820s, light was physicists thought of light as a transfer vibration, okay, a vibration that took place perpendicularly to the direction of motion, and that was important for understanding one of the properties of light, polarization. Okay, and the problem with that was that the only bodies that could sustain transversal vibrations were solid bodies. Okay, so to understand that property of light, one had to think of the ether as a solid body. Okay, and as I said, that was at odds with one of its other properties. Okay, that was supposed to be very, very rarefied entity. So remember what we said in the beginning about the life of objects, about the biography, that if we track those objects throughout their career, we see that they are endowed with contradictory properties, or with properties that are at odds with each other, and that gives rise to research problems for scientists, and that was one of those problems. Okay. The other dimension of the ether was its heuristic character, and that had a lot to do with its relationship with matter. And here there were two different theories. One developed by George Gabriel Stokes. Stokes suggested that as matter moves in the ether, it drags along completely the ether. Okay. But Fresnel, for different reasons, suggested that this drag is partial, okay, not complete. Now, in the 1850s and 1860s, James Clerk Maxwell, as is well known, developed a mathematically formulated electromagnetic theory of light, and on the basis of that theory he calculated the speed of electromagnetic waves, okay, and that speed turned out to be very close to the velocity of light, and that indicated to Maxwell that light is also an electromagnetic phenomenon. So up to that point we had different ethers, the luminiferous ether that was the carrier of light, and the electromagnetic ether that was the carrier of electromagnetic waves, and now these two ethers merged, okay, and on the basis of that theory, Maxwell predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves. That was confirmed in the 1880s by Heinrich Hertz. So even before that confirmation, in 1878, in an article that Maxwell wrote for the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, here's what he had to say about the ether. Now, whatever difficulties we may have in forming a consistent idea of the constitution of the ether, remember the contradictory properties. You know, it had to be a solid, but it had to be very rarefied at the same time. So there are difficulties in conceptualizing these entities. No matter, there can be no doubt, I mean this is a very strong language, that the interplanetary and interstellar spaces are not empty, but are occupied by a material substance or body, which is certainly the largest and probably the most uniform body of which we have any knowledge. A bit later, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, in a lecture, in a public lecture that he gave in 1884 in Philadelphia, again he asserted his confidence in the ether in no uncertain terms. So he said, you can imagine particles of something, the thing whose motion constitutes light, this thing we call the luminiferous ether, that is the only substance we are confident of in dynamics. Okay? One thing we are sure of, and that is the reality and substantiality of the luminiferous ether. Okay? And there are many passages that I've come across along these lines. Helmholtz says very similar things, and other important physicists during the late 19th century asserted their complete confidence in the existence of the ether. And as Lloyd Swenson said in the book that I mentioned before, and here's a quote, the major problems in physics in the late 19th century seem to divide into two broad categories, the physics of matter and the physics of the ether. So the ether occupied the half of physics. It was tremendously important. Now, how or why did it pass away? Okay. Now, as I said, from its very beginning, the ether was had been plagued with inconsistencies and conceptual difficulties. Those difficulties were never resolved. In the beginning of the 20th century, a new theory emerged, formulated by Einstein, that dispensed with the ether. Okay, and there was also no space for the ether in the emerging quantum theory. Okay, so at the theoretical level, I think these are the three main reasons. And at the experimental level, despite the many efforts by really superb experimentalists to detect the motion of the Earth or the solar system through the ether, despite all those efforts, that motion was never detected. And here the emblematic experiment is the Michelson-Morley experiment. It was performed initially by Michelson in 1881 in Potsdam, and then when Michelson went back to the United States, there was a series of experiments by Michelson and Edward Morley in Cleveland, and they were designed to test these two theories, Stokes and Fresnel. Okay, so the question was whether matter, as it moves through the ether, drags it along completely, or whether it drags it just partially. And it turned out that it drags it completely, okay, according to that experiment, because one could not detect any effect of that motion, okay, on the behavior of light, which meant that near the surface of the Earth, the ether was stationary. It was dragged along by the Earth, so one could not detect the Earth's motion through the ether because near the surface of the Earth there was no motion. I mean, the motion was non-existent. Okay, I'll skip that because we don't have time. And I'll just say a few things about how painful the abandonment of the ether was for the older generation. And so the metaphor of death is quite proper here. The older generation of physicists, I mean, they were not able to come to terms with the abandonment of the ether, and I think for a good reason. Okay? Because the abandonment of the ether came at a cost, and the cost was explanatory loss. One could not understand wave phenomena without a medium, an underlying medium that could carry those waves. So here's Lodge, Oliver Lodge. Waves we cannot have unless they be waves in something. Okay, so Einstein tells us that we can understand electromagnetic phenomena as wave phenomena, but without a medium. How is that possible? Lorentz, probably the most important physicist in the late 19th and early 20th century. Well, okay, we can drop the ether, we can drop the name, but we may use another word because we need a peg to hand all these things upon. Okay, so no matter what, we can drop the name, but there is something there, something that carries electromagnetic waves. So we move from Lodge was in Great Britain, Lorentz in Holland. We go to the States. William Magee was a president of the American Physical Society, and in 1912 he says that, okay, we can abandon the ether, but that would be a retrograde step. Okay. And why is that? Again, for the same reason, because even though the principle of relativity accounts for the Michelson-Morley experiment, without an ether, how can we understand wave phenomena? How can we account for the interference phenomena, the wave phenomena that made that experiment possible in the first place? So, okay, let me close very briefly. I hope that I have presented enough material to make plausible the thesis that scientific objects pass away in a variety of ways, depending first on the kind of objects that they are, and on their biography, the kind of life that they were leading. And we should understand death, the death of objects, as a process, a long process of fading away, and a very painful process at that, associated with loss and trauma. Thank you very much.
thank you, Professor Arabatzis, and for a very concrete talk as well. And you can open the discussion. We have very easily 20 minutes. So please, your question or comments.
Did the ether never surface again since the early times?
It has, actually. It has. Even Einstein, I mean, in the 1920s, said the ether exists in a certain way because space, empty space, has properties, okay, or space-time has properties. So, but it depends on what we mean by the ether. Okay, now the ether as a material medium that pervades space and that constitute an absolute frame of reference. Okay, in that sense, the ether has died. But in another sense, in a weaker sense, as you know, an indication of some kind of activity in space. I mean, there are physicists who have suggested that, and even later, even in the 50s and 60s, and even today, and important physicists. Dirac, for example, suggested a revival of the ether in that sense. But not in the older sense of a material medium that constitutes an absolute frame of reference. In that sense, it's gone for good.
There would be a question a bit related to that. Is there any relation between the theories of ether or the ether in physics and the concept of a field in physics? And what would those relations be?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In a way, the ether is a successor. The field is the successor concept. Okay, but now the ether is the field is a self-standing entity. Okay, there were fields in Maxwell and in Lorentz, but what were the fields? The electromagnetic fields, they were states of the ether. They were processes in the ether. Okay. Now, after Einstein, there are fields, but they are self-subsistent entities. They do not require substratum. Okay, and they can exist by themselves. So in that sense, they are very, very different entities. So you have waves, but without a medium that carries those waves. How is this possible? Nobody knows. You know, when I was at the university, and I had quite a few courses of electromagnetic theory, and that was a question that was nagging me. And I asked the professor, what is a field? Okay, he said, I don't know. It's mathematically specified. You can learn to solve problems. Okay, so you can use the fields, but as theoretical tools. But when it comes to their ontological status, he couldn't answer my question. Okay, a 19th century physicist would have no problem whatsoever answering my question. Okay, what are fields? They are states in the ether. They are processes in the ether. So there's a medium, an underlying medium. And waves or fields are just vibrations in that medium. As simple as that.
Can you go into the previous slide?
Sure.
The one that, yes, this one. I would like to know if Einstein, for example, ever replied to this. That seemed indirect attack to his theory. For example, William Nature, and how did he reply?
No, as far as I know, he never replied to this.
We could say that these questions do not make sense anymore in Einstein.
Do not make sense.
Yes, do not make sense
Uh-huh.
from the point of view of Einstein. For example, the last one, the need to have something to hang on, a peg to hang on.
Mm-hmm. For Lorentz, I think the idea of an absolute frame of reference was important. Okay, Why was that? For two reasons. The first was that, in Lorentz's theory, we see two things that are very similar to what we see in Einstein's theory, namely length contraction and time dilation. Okay, so as bodies move, their length is shortened. Okay, but this is a real dynamical effect that has to do with the transportation of matter through the ether. Okay? It's not a kinematic effect. Okay, and with respect to time dilation, again, this is a mathematical fiction. Okay, Lorentz till the end of his time kept believing in absolute time. He said, well, I have an intuitive understanding of simultaneity, of the simultaneity of two spatially separated events. Okay, and I don't need an operation to understand, simultaneity. But to do that, you need to have an absolute frame of reference, okay, that makes sense of absolute location, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what he had in mind. So we have a medium. We need to have a medium for having an absolute frame of reference and for understanding electromagnetic phenomena as wave processes in that medium. Okay, so you want to drop the name, fine with me, but there's something there. Okay, but I think Einstein, as far as I know, I'm not an Einstein scholar, but as far as I know, and from the reading that I've done for preparing for this workshop, I don't think that he ever replied to this. Okay, and what could he have replied? He says, I can give you. What he said in 1905 is that I can give you a way to understand electromagnetism that does not require the ether, okay, and that does justice to the relativity principle. Okay, but for those people, they needed more, and that's why I think Kuhn was onto something when he, stressed the explanatory losses. So when we move from a paradigm to another one, some things are lost, okay, and I think these passages describe very well the loss that the older generation felt with the abandonment of the ether. Okay, so it was not just a new theory that was simpler and empirically adequate and so on, and replaced another one that had problems, but the new theory was not able to give answers to these questions.
Yeah, Theo, I have a question that is related to what you call the biographical idiom. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the title of our meeting, the organizers choose a vocabulary that is more or less neutral with respect to the objects that mm-hmm. are in question. Mm-hmm. So transformation, degradation, disappearance. And you deliberately choose metaphors mm-hmm. From the realm of life, of biology. So you call it idiom. What status does it have in the context of our own activity as historians of science if we choose to take our concepts from a particular area of the sciences and try to understand in this frame what happens historically with respect to the process of the development of the sciences? So I just would be interested in reflection about that. Sure.
Well, this is a very, very important question, and a question that I've thought a lot about. It's an analogy, right? Or a metaphor, if you wish. But when we use analogies or metaphors, I think it's very useful to keep in mind what Mary Hesse suggested many years ago when she talked about analogy, and she suggested that analogies have positive, negative, and neutral aspects. Okay, So the positive aspects have to do with resemblance between the resemblance between one physical system and another. The negative aspects have to do with differences, okay, between one system and another, and the neutral aspects are aspects that we know nothing about and we have to investigate further. Now, when it comes to this metaphor, the biographical metaphor, the biographical idiom, again, I think it's very helpful to think of it in these terms. I mean, there's a positive analogy, a negative analogy, and a negative analogy. Now, the positive analogy has to do with some kind of activity, okay? Both positive and negative. I mean, it's the dimensions that you have stressed, generation of questions, recalcitrance, and so on. The issue of identity is crucial, and is crucial historiographically too. Okay. Now, if you write the history of an object, why does your history hang together? It has to be, in a minimal sense, about the same thing that you follow as you do in a biography, right? I mean, the biographical subject changes a great deal. I'm very different, fortunately or unfortunately, from what I was 30 years ago, right? But in a minimal sense...
How do you know that?
Yeah. Okay, take my word for it. But in a minimal sense, I'm the same person, and in that sense, it would make sense to write my biography. Okay, so in that minimal sense, I think one can write the biography of an object. So the question of identity is also crucial. So we have three different aspects that I stressed, heuristics, recalcitrance, and identity. But of course, there are negative aspects of the analogy. So objects do not have intentions. People do. Okay, and I think it's, well, I don't know if Bruno Latour would accept that, but I think it's important to keep in mind the differences too. Okay, so I found it a fruitful approach, and not just in my own work, but in your own work and in other people's work. But I think there are limitations also, okay, that we should definitely keep in mind.
Maybe to follow Hans-Georg, I think that really I wonder if it is possible to I know it's philosophy of science, it's absolutely not history of science now, that you can follow the same word, ether, for instance, during 4 centuries. And you have a history which is up the object, because there is no questions, imaginaries of the science, of modes of questioning things, which could be really compared between Huygens and, let us say, Lawrence, or people at the beginning of the 20th century, and so on. So I think that the question of that you posed in your paper for your invitation was, yes, more or less neutral, but I cannot imagine that we could answer this question on a so long period. It's not the same object. It's not the same way of doing. It's the same word, maybe, but it's not the same. And the first reaction, what do you say between field and ether? It's yes, spontaneously obvious that we have that immediately in mind. So it's the question, and I think it's very important to emphasize also the social and cultural worlds in which these objects are appeared and so on. So, and also your word of biography of objects, and your reaction that biography is a life science word. Yes, but biography and life, it's something who have in a certain unity of time. It doesn't have 5 centuries duration.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And I think that Bruno Latour, for instance, would never accept this idea. I'm not so close, but yes, of mode of existence of objects during a so long period.
Mm-hmm.
He is very preoccupied by the unity of the context in which we question the object, the mode of existence of things, and so on.
Okay, you are absolutely right. I mean, I should have perhaps I should have stuck to the 19th century, because then if we start thinking about Aristotle's use of the ether or Newton and so on, then it's a can of worms, and then you have all these problems. Are these people really talking about the same thing? And I'm very sympathetic to this approach. To what you are saying. What I just wanted to indicate or to point out was that even in the 17th century there was a problem that was a problem, not an entity, a problem that was very similar to the problem that occupied 19th century scientists, namely how action at a distance is propagated through space. Okay, but I fully take your point. Now, with respect to the social dimensions, again, there was no time to talk about this, but of course that they are crucial, especially if you look at the social dimension is really important if one wants to understand the abandonment of the ether, okay, and the reception of relativity theory in different national contexts. Okay, so it was more easily received in Germany. It was received with great difficulty in England. The French ignored Einstein. Okay, for the British, the ether was particularly important. Okay, because they were trained to do ether physics. Okay, so this had a lot to do with the particular training regime in Cambridge, and the way these people were brought up. Okay, so the ether was the bread and butter, so to speak, of their practice. So they were very reluctant to give it up. So these are issues that are definitely part of the story, and they have to be integrated into not a complete. I mean, there's no complete historical account, but in a fuller account of how these objects develop and are eventually abandoned. Okay, but I just want to say one thing more about your main criticism, which, as I said, I'm fully sympathetic to, about the identity of these objects, and I don't think it's a good idea to span centuries. Not even philosophers should do that. I mean, not just historians, but even philosophers shouldn't do that. But I think it's important even for historians to try to be clear about the issue of identity. What are our criteria, historiographical criteria of identity when we track something, track the trajectory of an object? What does it mean to say that we track a single object as opposed to a variety of objects, that all these objects are different? What are the criteria of identity and difference in those cases? And I think this is a philosophical question, but a question that we need to reflect upon when we come up with historical narratives.
Yeah, I would just like to make a remark, come back to this question and putting in contact with what you just said, which is the difference between objects and problems. So both of them can disappear in some sense,
Sure.
but they don't disappear in the same way. Objects may disappear because you have an experience, an experimental situation which tells you that this object is no longer something that you can maintain, but the problem continues to produce objects at the place of the one that you. But when the problem disappears, nothing comes in place of it. It's not a problem any longer. And I'm not sure we really have the theory of that, a theory of the death of problems. Why something isn't a problem any longer? So I don't know if I sense well what you said is something that happened in the 20th century with ether. And there's this famous quote from Einstein, which is probably not from Einstein, which says that, what is the cat quote, that the telegraph is like a cat from New York to, you know that quote?
No, I don't actually.
It's probably not from Einstein, but it makes the point. Because it would be an answer to this problem. It says something like the telegraph is very easy. It's just like a cat between New York and Los Angeles, and you just wave the tail at one point, and you moves in Los Angeles. And then the radio radio communication is the same thing, but without the cat. Yeah. So, in some sense, as far as I know, it's not a real quote from Einstein, but it could have been in the sense that it's not a problem any longer. You know, just don't have the cat. And I would be really interested in why and how it became no problem at all.
Yeah.
Not that we don't have the right options, it's that we don't need it any longer.
Okay. My first and honest reaction is that we need to think about this. I don't have a full answer to the question, but I think what is clear to me is that there are questions or problems that do not depend on particular theories or particular objects. Okay. So, for example, take any kind of interaction, gravity, electricity, magnetism, whatever. I mean, the question of the propagation of this interaction, I think, spans different theories and spans actually many centuries. Okay, so from the 17th till the 20th century. But there are problems that are specific to particular objects or to particular theories. So, for example, all those questions about the relations between ether and matter, what happens when matter moves through the ether, does it drag it along, or is the ether indifferent to the motion of matter? I mean, these are problems, these are questions that are specific to that particular object. I mean, if there's no ether, then you don't have to worry about the interaction between ether and matter. So, now, we need to think hard about problems that are specific to particular theories or to particular objects, and problems that in a way cut across the different theoretical frameworks. But what is clear is that, and I think Kuhn stressed that point too, that there are several problems that are specific to a paradigm or theory or whatever, and when that is abandoned, then the problem disappears. So think about for example, the question of what causes motion. Okay, now if you start thinking of motion as a state as opposed to a process, okay, then it doesn't need the cause. Okay, so the problem disappears. It's not that you have solved it, you have dissolved it. Okay, you have pushed it aside.
If you don't mind, if you agree, let's continue our debates and discussions with a coffee. Thank you once again for your call.